Ukraine has confined Russia's Black Sea fleet to port after an historic, spectacular strike with a sub-sea drone against a Kilo-class Russian submarine. Fuel trains, an oil refinery, a tanker, air defences and a fighter jet have all been hit this week as Kyiv chips away at the Kremlin's coffers. And troops have gained ground in Kupyansk. It has, by any measure, been a good week for Ukraine. Vladimir Putin has called Kyiv's European supporters swine. But everything hinges on whether Europe can step up this week to bankroll Ukraine for the next 2 years. Kharkiv again. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at the Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. That spectacular strike in Novorossiysk, you've probably seen footage of it already. An enormous plume of water erupting in the port as a Sea Baby drone sent there by the SBU intelligence service erupts underneath the stern of a Kilo-class Russian submarine. This was the first time a submarine like that has been hit by a submarine drone and in port in Novorossiysk, on the eastern edge of the Black Sea. That is where Russia's Black Sea fleet has been forced to retreat. It used to be based in Sebastopol in Crimea, but Ukraine's campaign of successful strikes over almost 4 years has forced those vessels back to the eastern edge of the Black Sea to make it harder for exactly these kinds of drone strikes. But once again, Ukraine has proven itself able to cross that greater distance to hit a high-value target. Why does a Kilo-class submarine matter? Well, these can carry caliber cruise missiles. They have been used, they are used to launch these land attack cruise missiles, which have a range that can hit anywhere inside Ukraine. And they have, and they do, and they are devastating. So disabling this submarine, a significant blow, symbolic and significant. The estimates of the value of that submarine ranging from between about 200 million to 400 million US dollars. Submarines are really expensive. These ones are diesel electric hunter killers. It's not the first one that has been destroyed. Perhaps you'll remember that in 2023, the Rostov-on-Don was hit in dry dock in Sebastopol by a British Storm Shadow cruise missile that had been donated to Ukraine. So now 2 submarines have been hit in this conflict. And when that first submarine, when the Rostov-on-Don was hit, I mean, that was the first time a submarine had been damaged in an act of war since the end of World War II. I was about to say since the Falklands, but since the end of World War II. And what are the knock-on effects? Well, most recently, we've seen that Russia appears to have sunk 3 barges in the entrance to that naval base to try and defend it, to close the entrance to the port from more submarine drones. And they've also erected what appears to be a barrage, a surface barrage, to defend against surface drones as well. By sinking those barges, Russia is effectively confining the other warships that are in port to stay in that base. So again, spectacular secondary impacts from that attack. And we've also seen, I think in a sort of proof that this was a really significant attack from Ukraine, we've seen Russia's sort of propaganda machine swing into action. Videos released claiming that there was no damage at all to the submarine. They showed footage of the boat on the surface, but of course they did not show its stern, its propeller, its steering mechanisms, where we understand that explosion, which would most likely to have been damaged because of where that explosion took place. It was probably a coincidence, but as Ukraine was releasing this spectacular footage, I was in the headquarters of Britain's MI6 intelligence service here in London, where the new chief, Blaise Metravelli, was talking about their commitment to action, to covert action, and a return, as she said, to their historic SOE instincts. And SOE, the Special Operations Executive, was a legendary British sabotage force that worked with local resistance and partisan groups in Nazi-occupied Europe. Their most successful attack, perhaps, or most memorable, being against the Norsk hydro plant in Norway, effectively denying Nazi Germany a nuclear bomb. We've also seen this week attacks on an oil tanker claimed by Ukraine, drones hitting a fuel train, and strikes on the Slavyansky oil refinery. All of that contributing to a record drop in the value of Russian oil, particularly out of Novorossiysk, where it has fallen to $38 a barrel due to the uncertainty of supply. Most recently, overnight, Ukraine's SBU has claimed that it has damaged another $200 million worth of Russian weapons, including 3 radars, different types of radars. This was all in occupied Crimea. 1 Pantsir air defense missile system, that's a medium short-range air defense system, and a MiG-31 fighter jet that was on the ground. While that's been happening, we've seen President Zelensky visiting the outskirts of Kupyansk in northeastern Kharkiv province. Kupyansk has been a place where Russian forces, they took it at the beginning of the war, they were forced back in the Kharkiv counteroffensive, they've been grinding forward for months. I was there with a drone team as they were sort of inching forward. They've made significant gains recently, but now Ukraine has pushed them back and is claiming that some troops left in the town are effectively cut off, a situation reminiscent of what happened to Ukrainian forces in Pokrovsk. But nonetheless, good news, some gains for Ukraine there. And General Alexander Syrskyi claiming that Ukraine's made also some marginal gains in Pokrovsk. You remember where Ukrainian forces had effectively been forced out of that town. On a tactical level, some of the spectacular footage we've seen this week includes the Azov brigade blitzing a Russian convoy. We've seen a tower, a sort of chimney, collapsed by a drone which dropped, I think, an anti-tank mine into that chimney. And what appeared to be a booby-trapped building that Ukraine had withdrawn from and Russian forces had come into, being destroyed in really spectacular fashion, looking like an organized demolition. But interestingly, that was in Novohorodne, and that was west of Pokrovsk. So when you realize that those things, that Ukraine is attacking Russian soldiers or targeting Russian soldiers west of Pokrovsk, it's a reminder of where Russia is advancing. And just to be very clear, of course, the advances are not one way. The direction of travel, the trend over months rather than over this week, has been the other way, has been Russian advances. And it's a little bit like where Ukraine has gained ground. It's a bit like squeezing a balloon, because where they've made advances in one place, Russians have swept round in another. And we see that in Kupyansk, because the Ukrainians are moving north and east. Just to the east of those positions, Russians have been gaining ground to the south. In Pokrovsk, as the Ukrainians have inched back towards the town, the Russians have continued to advance westwards to the south and further west of Pokrovsk in sort of Zaporizhia region as well. And also in Siversk. Latest reports from Siversk in northeastern Donetsk suggesting that is all but fallen. In terms of other Russian attacks, we've seen about 1,000 missiles and drones reported in the overnight strikes by the Air Force, 495 of them in one night. By the standards of the conflict at the moment, that's a relatively low number. Over the course of the week, 500 in one night remaining a lot. And there's been some pretty dramatic footage of some of those drone strikes over Odessa, including one of the Shaheds being shot down, erupting in a ball of flames, and another one hitting an apartment block. But it appeared to be a decoy or a faulty drone because it did not explode. How has Vladimir Putin responded? Well, in a meeting with his defense council in Moscow, he referred to European supporters of Ukraine as little piggies or swine. The Russian word was podzvinki. Chilling echo, I think, referring to leaders as pigs or swine, because that echoes the language of Adolf Hitler's senior lieutenants during World War II. Joseph Goebbels wrote repeatedly in his diaries of the British as swine. They used many similarly colourful words, but that, for someone, Putin, who is completely making these bogus claims that Ukraine is a land of Nazis, there he is echoing the language of the Nazis to criticise his political enemies. In this speech, he also showed no real willingness to negotiate. Whilst he claimed a willingness to engage in diplomacy, he didn't use the word negotiate. And in fact, he said that Russia's original war aims will, in his words, undoubtedly be achieved. Ukraine would be forced, and Ukraine's allies would be forced to address what he calls consistently the root causes of the war. Well, his original war aims are to topple President Zelensky, to subjugate Ukraine. So the fact he's still saying this suggests that he is not prepared to make any significant concessions. And it reveals the lie that Russia is engaging in good faith in negotiations. It isn't. The Americans appear to believe that Russia is, but certainly Ukraine and Ukraine's European allies significantly less convinced. We heard Blaise Metrovelli, the head of MI6, saying that Putin is dragging out these negotiations. And in private, senior defense sources here in London that I've spoken to would corroborate that. They see no evidence that Russia is willing to negotiate. Putin also talks about European elites being replaced. And that's interesting because it echoed the language not this time of the Nazis, it echoed the language of the United States' new national security strategy, which also was critical of the direction of travel led by European elites. And it talks about cultivating America, it talks about cultivating resistance in Europe. Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz has declared the Pax Americana, the era of American-led peace in Europe, to be over. And those points, I think, are all interrelated. And that brings us to what Europe has to do. There is a huge sense across European capitals that they need to step up, that now is the time. America is walking away, is less interested, is ruthlessly focused, as Friedrich Merz said, on its own national security interests. And that is not, as it used to be, as linked to Europe. Leaders are meeting in Europe to decide the fate of some 210 billion euros of frozen Russian assets. President Zelensky has made the point that Russia does not count its war dead, but it does count every dollar. And as European leaders have got closer to trying to use this money that's frozen in Europe to support Ukraine, we see increasingly angry outbursts and reactions from Moscow, a sense that this could make a difference. I've spoken to a number of top defense security people here who say that the money is one of, if not the most powerful lever that Europe can wield over Russia to force Putin to sue for peace, to force Putin to engage in these peace talks seriously. Poland's leader Donald Tusk has said Europe faces a simple choice: to provide money today or blood tomorrow. And he said not just for Ukraine, that he's talking about all of Europe. One of you in the comments from last episode, thank you very much. It was Jan from Belgium, wanted me to make the point, and it's a fair point, because Belgium is leading the resistance to this proposal. Ukraine's allies want to provide the money. Belgium is leading resistance. It's not because Belgium supports Russia, it's because Belgium is concerned about wearing the consequences of this decision alone, concerned that they will be sued successfully by Russia for releasing this money illegally. One of the proposals on the table, the money has been frozen. All of Russian assets, state assets in Europe, have been frozen indefinitely. What Kyiv supporters want to do is use that money as collateral for a loan, and the loan would see Ukraine stay in the fight through 2026 and into 2027. So it would achieve two things. It would keep Ukraine in the fight, and it would hit Moscow in the pocket. It's a double whammy. We will keep very close eyes on what happens with that. As ever, thank you very much for your questions. If you've got any, please ask them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can next time. We had two questions saying, why doesn't Zelensky demand that Putin hold a free and fair election? This is because one of the Russian demands, which is being sort of parroted by America, is that Ukraine hold democratic elections, because Ukraine is under martial law, has been since the first day of the war, and that effectively rules out the prospect of democratic elections. So President Zelensky remains in power beyond the original mandate of his democratically elected term. There's been a suggestion from America and from Russia that he's deliberately clinging on to power, that he's using the war to cling on to power. I mean, I find that faintly absurd. You see the level of work that Zelensky is forced to do, the conditions he is living through. I don't think anyone would want this war to last a day longer than it has to. But it's a good question, because Putin has held elections, but they are absolutely not free and fair. They are sort of sham votes, absolutely ridiculous, a way of cementing his tenure as an authoritarian dictator. The fact is, at this point, that would fall on deaf ears. Neither Russia nor, it seems, America wants to question the legitimacy of Vladimir Putin's tenure. Question number 2, why doesn't Europe hit back? It's a really good question. I think it relates to the money. That is the way that Europe can hit back most effectively at the moment. There are a number of countries, Poland, Sweden, Britain, Germany, very significantly, all trying to push for that to happen. There are other countries in Europe raising concerns. We'll see where that goes. Question number 3, can Russian vessels leave the Black Sea through the Bosphorus? Physically, they could, but legally, warships are not allowed to pass through the Bosphorus during war, and that is governed by the Montreux Convention, and it's being enforced by Turkey. Effectively, what that has meant, rather than Russia's Black Sea fleet leaving, what that has actually meant in practical terms is Russia's unable to reinforce the fleet with vessels, perhaps from the north, which would sail round from Murmansk through past Gibraltar into the Mediterranean and then ultimately into the Black Sea. That hasn't happened because the Black Sea is closed from that direction. Final question, what is the chance of the UK being attacked and by whom? Topical because this week we heard from the Chief of the Defence Staff, the most senior professional uniformed officer in the British Army, Chief Marshal Sir Richard Knighton. And he quoted a figure that suggested statistically it's around 5%, and that would be from Russia. He acknowledged that's a very low statistic, it's a low probability, but he said it's not zero, and therefore it cannot be ignored. And we have heard a lot of rhetoric about the risk of attack in the sense that the United Kingdom needs to become more aware of the threat, particularly as society is asked to make sacrifices and the government is asked to make commitments, financial commitments towards defence. Vladimir Putin insisting that that is all scaremongering rhetoric and Europe has nothing to be afraid of from his Russia. Thank you for watching. As ever, if you've got any questions, please do ask them in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can next time.